This is part of the video that accompanies your expose.
Epstein, then in his 50s, was also suspected of organizing sex activities with underage girls at his homes in New York City, New Mexico, and on his private island in the Caribbean.
You're talking about hundreds of children all over the world.
Victims that were alleged sex slaves of Jeffrey Epstein, that they brought over from Eastern Bloc countries.
I've seen hundreds and hundreds of girls go through Jeffrey's swinging door, his ever-revolving door.
This guy is big time. He knows people that know people that know people.
Flight
Barry Krischer to drop the investigation.
The U.S. Attorney's Office got involved with this case with Jeffrey Epstein's A-list of defense attorneys that are extremely well known and extremely powerful. I think these attorneys were able to manipulate the sitting U.S. attorney and the assistant U.S. attorney working the cases. A few things happened in this case that during my law enforcement career I've never seen before. The U.S. attorneys here had an indictment and they were sending it back and forth to Jeffrey's lawyers for changes. Never seen anything like that before.
Well, I started getting somewhat of an inclination that this is a situation where somehow, for some reason, the defendant and the government are working together against the victims, although that kind of conspiracy theory sounds so preposterous that I didn't want to believe it.
A subsequent FBI investigation found a sprawling network of victims and enough evidence to fill a 53-page indictment with federal sex crime charges.
That her story is true at all.
Now, Julie, if you can explain what the Federal Crime Victims' Rights Act and how does this play into the story? Explain exactly what the victims understood as these cases have moved forward in court and what may have been violated, why they have grounds for civil suits today.
Well, Congress passed the Crime Victims' Rights Act in order to give crime victims a say in their cases. In other words, Congress recognized that there was a time that prosecutors, police, and other people would just, investigate these cases and leave them completely out of the picture and not allow them to participate in the process. And because this had happened so often, Congress passed this law that enumerated certain rights that crime victims have. Among them, they have the right to confer with prosecutors to find out how's the case going. Prosecutors can't ignore their phone calls or their letters. They have to say, here's the status of the case, or they have to respond in some way. There's a number of other rights that are listed in the Act, but one of the key ones pertaining to this case is the one where they are to be notified of any impending plea deal. In this particular case, these plea negotiations were ongoing for a very long time. They were, he had a number of times where they signed on a dotted line with this plea deal, so they were official documents saying that there was a plea deal. And Epstein and his attorneys kept pressuring prosecutors to keep the fact that they had this plea arrangement secret. And not only did they convince Acosta to keep it quiet and not even tell the victims about it, but they also persuaded Acosta to seal it, meaning nobody, the media, the public, they went out of their way to make sure this whole thing was signed and negotiated, signed and sealed in secret. So by the time it was all done, Epstein appeared in court. He was sentenced. By the way, they didn't even tell the judge. In some ways, they misled the judge into what the contents and what the gist of the deal was. They misled the judge in court at his sentencing hearing about what this case was about. And it wasn't until after he was already in prison or in jail that the women and their lawyers realized what just happened. How did this happen? What happened to the FBI case? And then the prosecutors didn't even tell them. Acosta didn't tell them. No one would tell them exactly what the deal even contained. They had to go to court as part of this crime victims' rights lawsuit. They filed a motion asking a federal judge to enforce, wait a minute, we're crime victims. We were supposed to be told about this. And the U.S. government, the federal prosecutors essentially said, tough. You know, you're going to have to take us to court. If you want to see what's in this agreement, sue us. And that's what they had to do. And it took them months to be able to even look at the plea deal to even find out what happened. And it took he was practically out of prison before the public knew the contents of this non-prosecution agreement.
This may be a ridiculous question to ask.